today, as always, wherever you're doing it on the podcast platforms or YouTube. It's all great. I want to thank Mickey Joe Hart for coming on last week. Had a great chat with Mickey Joe about creativity and mental health and the Eurovision. Obviously, I couldn't avoid it. Mickey probably would have wanted me to avoid it. He's talked about it so much, but we got to talk a bit about his collaborations as well, like with the likes of Paul Brady, who's a big inspiration in his eyes. And it was a lot of fun. I even got to ask him, does he still have the green guitar? And I can tell you right now, he still has the green guitar and his daughter plays it. And that's great. So thanks for all your support during the week and for all, the posts we put up. And we really appreciate it. We're going to get into this week. I'll introduce the guest as the author of This Day in Irish History, which you see behind me, and the man behind the popular at the Day Irish Twitter account, Padraic Coffey. How are you doing, Padraic?
I'm very well, Derek. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. Beautiful day here. I know you're in Canada, and I'm gonna probably show some stereotype, but is it still snowing over in Canada?
No, well, so I live in Vancouver, which is in British Columbia, which is the west of Canada. We don't get as much snow as you would think from television. Because a lot of what you see of Canada is Ontario, Ottawa, Toronto, places like that, and it's quite different over here. It's closer to somewhere like Seattle in the US, because that would be the nearest major American city. Because directly below where I am is Washington State, and Seattle is obviously probably the most famous city there. But no, not so much. We did have a bit of snow last week, so you're not that far off, but it didn't really stay.
Yeah, well, that's all right. And you see, this is where my Canadian geography falls apart, and picking out the cities and not really knowing where they are. But obviously, over that side, it's quite wet around Seattle and all that, around Washington State. Yeah. It's the same in Vancouver.
Yeah, they call it Raincouver. Although having moved here from Ireland, I think it rains more in Ireland.
Okay.
I think what they think of as being a majorly rainy city would not compare to Western Europe.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And I remember we won't get too bogged down in Vancouver, but I remember there was I think the X-Files was shot there, and I remember in particular
it was
it seemed to be quite wet there all the time. But obviously, if that's the look you're going for.
And they always were in different parts of the US, even though it was all filmed in BC, or most of it was filmed in BC. So it's kind of it's odd that it would be rainy everywhere in America, where it obviously was set. But yeah, that's where they filmed it. Yeah, they film an awful lot of TV shows here and films.
Is it a tax reason, or is it?
It's for tax reasons. It's obviously cheaper because the Canadian dollar is weaker than the US dollar. But so many shows here. Supergirl I've seen filmed. I mean, I've never watched Supergirl, but if you're aware of the show Supergirl, I'd be walking to work and I'd see them filming that downtown, that kind of thing. I think the Batgirl or Batwoman.
Oh, there was
one of those shows. So you get an idea, a lot of superhero shows and that kind of thing.
There was a lot of go for it.
Yeah. You'd be walking to work and then there'd be a film crew and they'd basically say, you can't walk here. Can you wait a minute? And you have to kind of stand there while somebody drives by on a motorcycle or something. But they sometimes call it Hollywood North because they film so much here. But I surprisingly haven't seen that many celebrities. For a city that is always, films are always being shot in. The Deadpool films as well. They were shot here. And this Ryan Reynolds, who's the star of those films, he's from Vancouver, so that might have been the reason it was shot here as well. He might maybe wanted to throw some work to his hometown, but so lots of superhero things.
It's going to say it literally is all superheroes. But I've got one little kind of nugget on that before we kind of get into the episode. When I would say I was quite young. I was about 12 or 13. I was on a bus, and this ties in with history actually. But I was on a bus just pulling out of Busaurus in Dublin, and myself and my brother looking over at this film crew over on that large old building that I should know what it is. And there was something going on. There was a lot of people over there. We never found out. So about 5 years after that, I'm watching Michael Collins, the film, and Liam Neeson. And that was the film that we saw because I could recognize the costume. So I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So that's my only time I've ever seen anyone being filmed for a film.
Yeah.
But anyway, we really went off with there. But Padraic, let's bring it back to you if you don't mind. So, could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
So I was born in Sligo, and I grew up just outside of Tubbercurry in South County Sligo. And after I did my leaving cert, I went to Dublin to study in UCD, and I did an undergraduate there. My major was English, and then I took a year off and I went back and I did an MA. And my MA was in film studies, actually. And for my thesis, I wrote all about cinema and Northern Ireland, particularly films about the Troubles. And kind of, I was examining it from a unionist perspective, because if you look at an awful lot of the films that are made about the Troubles, a lot of them are about the IRA and are about Republicans, and there really aren't that many from a unionist perspective. So that was kind of what I honed in on in the thesis. But it was a film studies thesis, but it obviously involved an awful lot of history as well, and a lot of books, and that kind of thing. And so I suppose you could say that was sort of an earlier example of where I was writing about history, albeit like with a kind of an arts angle on it, because it was about films as well. But so that's where I studied, was in Dublin in UCD, and I lived there for quite a few years. Yeah.
Can I this is again going off the beaten track, but have you seen Belfast?
I haven't yet. No, I really want to, but I haven't seen it. It's getting a lot of buzz. It's nominated for quite a few Oscars, so I am looking forward to seeing it, but I haven't. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen it. And again, it's the same thing. My mom went to see it, and she really, really liked it. And it's, I don't know if it's going to be a generational kind of thing, because my mom would have been in Donegal for in her childhood. She would have been in Dundalk, which is obviously very close to what all the stuff was happening. And I guess when you're in and around it, it obviously creates more of a psychological impact on you. And I wonder if that was kind of, she took some of that from the film. And not to say that I wouldn't take something, that I wouldn't enjoy the film, but it would be interesting now for myself or yourself to see it from a kind of a younger generation, and maybe someone who wasn't right there when it was all going on,
Yeah, I think so. I think if you remember those news stories, and if you live close to the border, or you lived in the north, then it probably is going to have more of an impact on you. Like Kenneth Branagh, it's funny because he's very much thought of as like an English actor, a Shakespearean actor, but he was born in, I don't know, was he born in Belfast, but he was born in Northern Ireland, I believe, and he left there when he was quite young. And that's kind of, from what I've read about the film, and again, I haven't seen it, that's what it's about, is his childhood there before he left. So it is an interesting project for him. I am looking forward to seeing it, but it will be interesting to see. And it's also interesting to see because films like that are set somewhere like Belfast, they don't usually get a lot of attention in North America, I mean, I suppose they do, like they have done in the past, films like In the Name of the Father and so on. But the fact that it's nominated for all these Oscars is interesting, because I imagine a lot of American and Canadian viewers will be looking at it, and their knowledge of the situation will be like obviously less than people who live in that part of the world. So it'll be interesting. But again, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah. So fingers crossed I do get to see it shortly.
Yeah, me too. So Padraic, could you give us when did you, an idea, I suppose, of the first time you became aware of mental health?
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I don't know when I first heard the term mental health. It might be a relatively new term. And when I say new, I mean like in the last 20 or 30 years. I don't know, was it used much in the 60s or 70s? It might have been, but I'm really not sure. I do think that mental health and depression, and I'm not trying to equate the two, but I think it comes up a lot when people talk about having depression. I do think it is something that is common in Ireland and probably common in most places, but I do think that It's talked about quite a bit in Ireland, but that's not to say that I think Ireland has a handle on it, really. But just that it is something that is spoken about. I remember reading a book when I was still a teenager, still in secondary school, by Gareth O'Callaghan. Do you remember him?
Yeah, I remember the name, yeah.
He was a DJ. I don't think he's a DJ anymore, but he was a DJ, I believe, on RT Radio. And he wrote a book, I think it was called A Day Without Hope. And I read that probably in 2003, 2004. And that was all about his struggles with depression. And he had quite a successful career. You know, he was on the radio, he was earning good money and so on, but he had this crippling depression and stuff. It was quite an interesting book to read. It was you know, a relatively short book. And that's, I suppose, one of the earlier examples I can think of, you know, thinking about mental health and thinking about depression and how people kind of coped with it. But I don't have a specific moment that I can remember when it sort of all clicked. You know, I think it's sort of an ongoing conversation everywhere, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has become one of my favorite questions because of the variety of answers that I've been given from people of different ages, different genders, things like that, where it's, you know, some have only heard about it in the last year and some have heard about it, you know, because their mother was a psychiatric nurse. And so it's all these kind of a wide range of them. So this may be, well, you'll be the judge of this part, but this may be a dumb question. What was history your favorite subject in school?
It wasn't, to be honest with you. English probably would have been my favorite subject, so it would make sense that I studied English, you know, when I went to UCD. I did study history, but I wasn't great at it, to be honest with you. It wasn't one of my better subjects, and I did it for the Leaving Cert. But I'm sure the format has changed since then, but it's quite a difficult exam if you're not great at essay writing. Like, I can't remember exactly what it was, and I could probably look up the paper from the year that I did the Leaving Cert, but something like 5 or 6 essays over the course of 3 hours. I mean, that's very tough, you know, because you kind of have to just learn all this information over 2 years when you think about 5th and 6th year. But really, it's over several years because it takes into account your junior cert, and it takes into account probably what you learned in primary school. And you kind of have to just throw it all down on the page in the course of a few hours. So it wasn't my favorite subject at school. Really, my interest in history kind of grew after I left secondary school. And it was sort of a personal thing. It was a personal pursuit. I think a lot of it had to do with kind of how accessible information has become in the last, 20 plus years with really with the internet. And it's a real double-edged sword, because there's an awful lot of rubbish on the internet and misinformation and bad history. And that was something, I know we'll get to the book in a minute, but that was something I wanted to avoid in the book. But there is it's an amazing the amount of resources there are on the internet, you know, in terms of old newspapers, documentaries, interviews with people from the past, you know, a lot of books that maybe are out of copyright. You know, you can read the full books online in PDF form or that kind of thing. So it's kind of, as someone who remembers, you know, before we got the internet, you know, when I was still a teenager, you know, it's amazing how accessible information is today compared to then, you know. So that was kind of when my interest in history sort of, which I'd always had, but that was kind of when it grew, was post-secondary school. So I do think it's an important subject, but I was never great at it, to be honest.
Yeah, that like the whole thing about your interest being sparked in something. When history was my favorite subject, it was the best result I got in the Leaving Cert. I mean, it wouldn't have been hard, but I'm gonna take it. But my teacher was particularly influential in that kind of, you know, sparking, you know, the interest, because of how he approached it and how he spoke about history. And he had this great gravitas in his voice and his mannerisms and stuff. But in particular, it was his enthusiasm for the subject, and you can't help but be roped in a little bit by that, you know. And I think when I was doing the leaving, there was like Europe from 1870 and Irish from 1870, something like that along those lines. So it was kind of, it was constricted to Ireland and Europe, you know, and then we, you know, I got into the American stuff. But yeah, it's to do with that kind of my teacher and just the whole thing of there's, how can you not be fascinated by something like history, you know? By obviously we look forward to things all the time, but looking back on the mistakes that we did in the past and the good things we did in the past, it's very exciting. And as you say, it's been opened up in the last 20 years to pretty much everything. And it's brilliant for many reasons. But yes, so speaking of Twitter, which rolls in perfectly with that, but why did you decide to set up at This Day Irish on Twitter?
So I decided to set it up because social media, anytime you log on to social media, you would see someone commemorating the anniversary of an event or somebody's birthday. You know, it would say like, you know, this person was born on this day, you know, happy birthday, this person, whoever it was, you know, usually a celebrity or somebody like that, but it might be somebody with more relevance, more significant in another field, you know. Or there'd be, oh, it's this many days since this agreement was signed, or this many days since this battle was fought, or this many days since wherever. And it was, you know, you'd always see that. And there are history accounts like that on Twitter. But I thought to myself, what if you did one just for Irish history? Because, you know, you could hone in on it. You wouldn't be thinking, oh, what should I cover today? Because every day there's dozens and dozens and dozens of significant things that have happened around the world. But if you're just talking about Ireland or just talking about Irish history, it makes it a little bit easier to narrow down on. And I just thought it would be interesting because I thought, well, I thought to myself, I'd be interested in that. You know, if this Twitter account or this, because I started it on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, although I update Instagram significantly less than the other two. But I thought I'd be interested in this if it already existed. So that's kind of why I started it, because I thought if I'm interested in this, then other people will be as well. So that was the reason, really. Yeah,
and like the success of it is pretty much as you described what you would be like yourself, looking in on something that would be there. But like, and we're going to talk about the book, obviously, but the way it's structured and written is very particular in that it's, you know, it's so accessible for each date, we'll say. So you pick whatever date it might be. It's something that you can, which I read it straight through, right? From back to front. So it wasn't, but it's one of those that you can leave on a coffee table book, obviously lovely hard, you can see it here, lovely hardback book, selling it so well there. But the idea that you can dip in and out, and that's what I love about it. And it's comprehensive in the details within the date, but it's also like short enough to hold your attention. Does that make sense without being kind of... Yeah.
That's exactly what I was hoping for, because there are a lot of books about history and about Irish history. There are hundreds and hundreds of books about Irish history, and they're brilliant. And they will have more detail than my book will have, probably, because they will have been written by somebody with maybe a PhD or somebody who's a professor and who will delve into history and into like the minutiae of history. And my book was meant to be something very, very accessible. It was meant to be something that you could, as you said, pick up and put down, and maybe it would spark your interest and think, oh, I want to read more about that subject. Maybe I'll look at the bibliography and find a book that's mentioned, or I'll just go into the bookshop and look for it, or go to the library and look for it. But it's meant to be something that's sort of like, every entry is relatively short. I aimed for about 300 words with each of them. Some of them are a little bit more than that, but I'd say most of them are around 300 words or so. And so you can read them, get a sense of the key dates, the key facts and figures, the key people involved, hopefully some quotes, because I think quotes are very good to put history in context and put an event in context. But then, you know, that's it, really. You know, it's not going to be, if you wanted to read like an in-depth look at a particular subject, you might not get that from the book. But what you will get is lots and lots and lots of short entries on different parts of history over spanning, you know, many different years. So that was kind of how the book has turned out.
And that there's the brilliant idea of the many different subjects that are covered as well, which is brilliant. It's not as it could be a certain way where it's just about politics, or could be just about sport, whatever it might be, but it jumps in and out. I've asked Padraic if he wouldn't mind reading out 3 dates for me that I've picked. So I went through a process where I was picking out loads of different interesting dates. So the first day I'm going to ask you to read out, Padraic, is the 2nd of April, 1993. I will introduce it. People will know so Annie Murphy appeared on the Late Late Show, and there was a chat. And Padraic, have you got the date ready there?
I do, yeah. I have the book here in front of me.
Would you mind just reading out that date for me?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Okay. So on the 2nd of April, 1993, Gay Byrne interviewed Annie Murphy on the Late Late Show. The previous year, Bishop of Galway Eamon Casey had resigned following revelations that he had fathered a child, Peter, with Murphy in the 1970s, and had taken £70,000 from diocesan funds in Galway, which he had given to her. Prior to the interview, Murphy had written a book, Forbidden Fruit, The True Story of My Secret Love for the Bishop of Galway, a title that many saw as salacious in what was still one of the most devout nations on the planet. Byrne was careful to present his questions in such a way as not to demonize Casey. At one point, it was claimed that Murphy had introduced an audience member to a man, not Casey, whom she described as, quote, the father of my child. That is a lie, Murphy flatly responded. Byrne at one point suggested that the book presumably will become a movie in due course, a comment that seemed to imply a financial motive to Murphy's actions. Murphy brought up the fact that Casey had tried to persuade her to give Peter up for adoption. Byrne countered, quote, he would say he was doing that, Annie, because he didn't have faith in your capacity to look after the child. That's what he would say. And how do you know that? Murphy replied. Perhaps the most infamous exchange came towards the end of the interview, when Byrne said, if your son is half as good a man as his father, he won't be doing too badly. I'm not so bad either, Mr. Byrne, Murphy shot back as the audience broke into applause.
Thank you very much for that, Padraic. It can be seen on YouTube, the interview. It is a modern day Joan of Arc kind of situation. I've seen the film The Passion of Joan of Arc, and it reminded me of that because for one, Gay Byrne kind of comes in towards the end where he sits down beside her, and those exchanges that you read. But during the interview, there's a few people up the front, and they're all having goes, basically having little saying that this didn't happen. There's a great dignity to Annie Murphy in the interview. How someone like that could hold it together, it's very uncomfortable to watch.
It is an uncomfortable watch, and it's great that it's on YouTube, and there are probably clips of it on the RT site, although maybe not the full interview. But yeah, you can watch the whole thing on YouTube if you want. But yeah, that was an interesting date to choose. One thing I should say about the book is that there are an awful lot of modern dates in it. There are probably more from the 20th century than from any other century, and that's because so many dates when we talk about history are not very precise. You can talk about a year that something happened, but you might not have the exact date. I mean, if we're talking about the 13th century, the 14th century, we don't tend to talk about 24th of April, 25th of April. We tend to just talk about this happened that year, But so it is a particularly modern event, that Annie Murphy interview. But I think it's important because, first of all, the Late Late Show was and probably still is the most widely watched show on RT. If anything, it was probably more widely watched back then because this was before Netflix and the internet and all the other things. So you probably had over 1 million people watching it in a relatively small country. And as I mentioned in the entry there, Ireland was still very, very devoutly Catholic at the time. And so to have someone like the Bishop of Galway, Eamon Casey, he wasn't just a significant, member of the clergy. He was kind of like a celebrity. And I'm saying this as someone who's kind of looked at the period, because obviously I was still very young when this happened. But if you look at the visit of Pope John Paul II to Ireland in 1979, You know, Eamon Casey was there at the mass that was being given in Phoenix Park, and so was Father Michael Cleary, who's another priest who has since been outed as the father of a child. But they were kind of like celebrities getting the crowd riled up. You know,
Yeah.
Ireland's relationship with the clergy is really interesting when you think about it. And so, like early 1990s network television, you know, this interview about somebody who would have been such a respected figure who had fallen so much from grace. It was, you know, it might not make as much sense in other countries as it does in Ireland, you know.
Yeah.
But it was a because I don't think other countries, I mean some countries do obviously, but I don't think other countries have the same relationship with the Catholic Church as Ireland had in
Yeah.
the past.
And I think,
and so it was interesting, yeah.
yeah, I think the audience members would have gone down with that ship regardless. It seemed that, you know, they were more interested in believing, the bishop than the lady sitting there who seemed to be completely 100% genuine, but that wasn't getting through to them at all, I suppose. But Padraic, just allow me to, if you don't mind, just read out an advert and we will get right back into it. So, Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. So the book project, I can only imagine, Padraic, is fairly daunting. Would that be the right description?
I mean, there was a lot of work in it, but I started the social media accounts in 2018,
okay,
and I started writing the book probably about 2020. So there was a couple of years between when I started the social media account and when I started physically, you know, sitting down and writing the book. And to prepare for the social media account, you know, you would go through each day and you'd think about what would be a good thing to talk about on this day, and then obviously you would write it and prepare it to post online. But you end up with a lot more to talk about than you end up talking about on social media, because social media is a very concise way of sharing information, especially on Twitter, because you only have 280 characters, which is something around 40 words, maybe less or maybe slightly more, but very, very few words. So you end up with all this stuff being like, I wish I could mention that on Twitter, but I don't want to, you know, write a tweet and then write another tweet underneath it and another tweet underneath that. You know, you want to kind of keep it concise and kind of keep it accessible. So when it came to writing the book, I thought, well, this will be an opportunity for me to put more of that information in that I kind of had to prune for putting it on Twitter and putting it on social media. But it was daunting because, you know, you want to write a good book. You want to write a book that's balanced. You want to write a book that people will be interested in. You want to write a book that people will hopefully learn something from that they didn't know before. So, you know, and as I mentioned earlier, there are hundreds and hundreds of books about Irish history. So you kind of have to approach it in a way that's going to make it different. You know, you don't want to just recycle somebody else's book. You know,
for sure, yeah, 100%. And there's something I mentioned before we start recording. The idea, and as I was reading the book, I kind of thought about this, where say it's the 2nd of April or something, and say if 3 really important things happen, how does one go about? Because that was like me picking out the dates that I wanted to see or ask you to read. How difficult was that?
It really depended on the day, but it was difficult. There were definitely some times when I really wanted to talk about one topic, but there was another topic that was slightly more important, and I didn't want to make an exception and say, like, I know April 2nd, we want to talk about the Annie Murphy interview, but there's this other thing that happened on April 2nd, so I'm going to write another entry here. Even though, you know, there would have been nothing stopping me doing that, but it wouldn't have been consistent, you know. I wanted to keep it one event per day, you know. So how I decided on that, ultimately it came down to just a kind of a gut feeling of this is the more appropriate one to talk about, you know. Like, for example, the Stardust fire in Dublin in the early 80s, that was on I believe the 14th of February or the 13th of February, one of those dates. and obviously very tragic event, very, very well known in modern Irish history. And so I thought it appropriate to talk about that in the book. But there was another event that I really wanted to work in, and it was a little bit more peripheral to Irish history, but I thought it was really interesting. There was a woman called Kay McNulty, and she was born in Donegal, but she had emigrated to the US when she was very young with her family. And she was one of the 6 programmers on the first general purpose computer, which it's one of those things where you only see it written down. I believe it's ENIAC, so I think it's the ENIAC or the ENIAC or something like that. But the fact that one of the 6 programmers for the first general purpose computer was a Donegal woman by birth, I thought that was really interesting, and I thought it would be great to include that in the book, and people would be like, wow, I've got to learn more about her. But again, I just couldn't do it because I had to go with the one that I thought was maybe just more relevant. So you do get situations like that where you're kind of torn between 2 dates, but ultimately it's a gut feeling, and it's like, what is the better one to include? And then there are other dates where really it's obvious there's only one you can talk about, and that's the one you're going to talk about. But yeah, it was hard. I mean, I thought to myself, could I get another book out of this? Another day in Irish history or something like that. But I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if there would be enough material for that. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was kind of a judgment call.
Do you have any plans for writing another book, whether it's Another Day in Irish History or something else?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't write Another Day in Irish History, just because I think I've written all I can on that. I mean, if there was a way to incorporate the pieces of history that I wasn't able to include in this book, I would do it.
Yeah.
Maybe just like things you didn't know about Irish history. That would be one. I mean, one I've thought about, but I haven't put any work towards it, and I don't even know if I would be the person qualified to write it. Would be maybe doing a similar book, but from the perspective of a different country. Right. So I live in Canada now, and I've lived in Canada for a few years. So one I could write would be This Day in Canadian History, which I'm not as familiar with, but something like that, or even This Day in American History. And I'm sure there are books like that already, and I actually wouldn't want to read them, because I wouldn't want to influence myself in that way if I were to write something like that. But that's an idea I had. Another idea I had would be maybe like a sort of a kind of a chronology of Irish history, but looking at it through quotes, because I think what people say is it can get to the essence of something so quickly. I mean, reading a news report that's 300 words long is obviously very useful, and you get a lot of the details. But sometimes just a quote that's like 10 words long can tell you everything. You know what I mean? Like an eyewitness account of something. Yeah. I thought to myself, would that work? Maybe a book like that, but nothing. I have no immediate plans. I haven't, I haven't got in touch with O'Brien, the publishers, and said that I want this to be my next book or anything like that. But yeah, something like that. Maybe something else, looking at Irish history from a different perspective, like a chronological look at it, or something that included the material I wasn't able to include, or maybe looking at another country. But so far, I haven't any immediate plans to do so.
Yeah,
but I would definitely read. I would read a book like This Day in American History or This Day in Canadian History.
Oh yeah, but again, it goes back to, because I love reading about American history, but again, it goes back to how it's written, and that's what I loved about your book, like the way it is written in like I explained earlier on, and it kept my interest throughout. And I think we'll go for another date now, actually. So the 20th of July, 1974. I for some reason didn't write down, but I kind of have an idea what this is, but it's going to be a surprise for me as well as for the audience, basically, which is good. But yeah,
this is Women Invade 40 Foot.
That's it.
Yeah. So on the 20th 20th of July 1974, a group of about 10 women, styling themselves the Dublin City Women's Invasion Force, led a protest at the hitherto male-only bathing place of 40-foot Sandy Cove, County Dublin. Among them were journalist Nell McCafferty, future politician Nuala Fennell, and poet Mary Darcy. This was symbolic of a growing confidence among the women of Ireland, increasingly set on asserting their rights. In 1971, the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, co-founded by McCafferty, had travelled from Dublin to Belfast to buy contraceptives, illegal in the Irish state since 1935, and in 1973, a ban on women working in the civil service after marriage had been lifted. The sight of women swimming in an area previously used exclusively by men may have seemed minor by comparison, but it was enough to ruffle the feathers of many at 40-foot that day. According to McCafferty, quote, there were loads of sexist abuse from the men in language that was acceptable at the time. In footage shot for RTE, one angry patron can be heard telling a reporter, get out. There was a time when no self-respecting women would be in here anyway. The women carried placards with slogans like, out from under and into the swim, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll win between the sheets, and the 40-foot is for women too. The 40-foot holds a distinctive place in the history of Dublin. The first chapter of James Joyce's Ulysses ends with Buck Mulligan plunging into the, quote, scrotum-tightening sea for a swim. A year on from the women's protests, it had been integrated, a move welcomed by one man whom McCafferty met there in 1975, who told her that, quote, it humanized it. It wasn't until 2013, however, that the local Sandy Cove Bathers Association admitted women.
Thank you very much. It's the reason I picked this one, I guess, because I recently swam in around there for the first time. I couldn't get in at the 40-foot because there was too many waves, but Sandy Cove, it's basically just around the corner. But my mom had spoken to me a little bit about the ban on women, swimming in there. And when you kind of think of like 74, I know it's nearly 50 years ago now, but it really isn't that long ago. And to think that there was a ban on women getting into that, it's basically getting into the sea. It just happens to be at a certain rock. It's and fair play to the women for doing it, but I can't get my head around the date of it being this just in 1974.
Yeah, it is strange. Things like that. There were quite a few entries in the book from that period, from the 70s, that do deal with women and do deal with women's rights. Like I mentioned there about the contraceptives train going up to the north and coming down with contraceptives and so on. And also, there are cases of people importing contraceptives and it being seized by customs and that kind of a thing.
And it's mentioned in the Annie Murphy interview as well. They bring up the fact of rubbers. Did it call them rubbers? I think the lady in the front row calls them rubbers. That Annie Murphy had brought them over from America and smuggled them into Ireland.
Yeah, it's crazy. It is crazy. I mean, it's actually something that isn't mentioned in the book, but it's amazing how recent it is that you could buy condoms in the likes of Boots or other chemists and pharmacies like that. It's kind of, because I'm fairly sure you couldn't in the 90s, or at least the early 90s. So it probably was around that time. So definitely not in the 70s. But but there's nothing. That's one thing, because that's dealing with a sexual thing. But this has nothing to do with sexuality. This is just, as you said, women going for a swim, and the fact that they couldn't do it until then, and it took a protest to do it. It wasn't like it was changed and then they went in. They did it, proactively to sort of to bring about a change. And if you go to the RTE archives, which you can look at online, which is another great resource and was very helpful writing the book, you can see that news report. You can see men being furious that these women were daring to enter into this male-only area. So it is interesting, yeah. And I think it's important. It's important to include dates like that, because one person could look at that and go, "Wow, weren't those women very brave to do that?" And they were. But another person could look at that and go, God, wasn't Ireland backwards that it took that kind of a thing in the 1970s to change that? It's sort of, you can read that and come away being like proud to be Irish that those women did that. But you could also be like embarrassed that was happening in Ireland in the 1970s.
It's true. Yeah.
But yeah, that was an interesting one.
And I'll have one more now in a couple of minutes. It goes back a bit further. So like when you went to Canada, actually, I wanted to ask you a bit about that at the start, but did you immediately take to it? Was there something that you really liked?
Canada?
Yeah.
I don't know. So I came over here with my wife, my now wife, like a good few years ago. It was 2015 when we moved over here, quite a few years ago, 7 years this year. And we came over without knowing whether or not we were going to stay. We came over on a 2-year working holiday visa, kind of, which loads of Irish people were doing. I mean, there were loads of Irish people in the city, and there still are, but I think probably not as many as there probably aren't as many coming over as there were back then. And we came to Vancouver, which is, as I say, it's a West Coast city. It's closer geographically to Seattle than it is to, like, much closer than it is for example, than Toronto or cities like that, major Canadian cities. I mean, Canada is huge, as you know, geographically. It's, I think, the second largest country in the world after Russia, I believe. I could be wrong about that. And it's very different from Ireland, very different from Dublin, but also probably different from a lot of the cities that Irish people would have tended to move to in the past, which are kind of East Coast cities. Like when you think of Irish people coming to North America, you tend to think of Boston, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, places like that. You don't really think of like Vancouver, BC, or even Seattle, Washington, even though there are Irish people there, but you just don't think about them being there. So I do like it here, but there are a lot of differences, and the problem with living here for several years is you forget what those differences are. They're really obvious when you move here first. You think, oh, that's quite different. This is quite different, but after a while, you just forget them. It would probably take a trip back to Ireland for me to remember what the differences are.
Yeah.
But it's it's a lovely city. I mean, there's a reason they film so many superhero films here and other things. It's got gorgeous mountains and nature, and it's you've got lakes nearby, and you've got the sea. It is a nice part of the world to live in, but it does have its problems, like every place does.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I just wanted to ask because I have a friend in Toronto, but I don't know anybody in Vancouver, obviously, so it'd be just interesting. And I think, not that it would, go somewhere else for now anyway, but, the idea of Canada would always be more appealing to me than, say, America or Australia, for instance, because, well, Australia distance-wise, America just kind of, I don't know what's going on over there, but we won't get into that. It's not the place for that, Padraic. Padraic, so we have one more date actually for you. So this one is going to be the 3rd of June, 1884. This was one that fascinated me because I had never heard anything about this. Maybe many people have, but I haven't. So go on ahead there, Padraic.
Okay, so the 3rd of June, 1844. This is the hypodermic needle is used for the first time. On the 3rd of June, 1844, the hypodermic needle, invented by Irish doctor Francis Rind, was used for the first time. Rind fashioned a syringe to inject morphine into the face of a woman with neuralgia in Dublin's Meath Hospital, located on Heytesbury Street, which has since been incorporated into Tala Hospital. The patient, Margaret Cox, had tried drinking a solution of morphine to dull her severe pain, but with no success. Rind sought to help her by injecting medicine directly under her skin, near a facial nerve. He built an improvised syringe using a small tube, cannula, and a cutting device, trocar, puncturing a hole in the woman's skin and allowing the morphine to flow freely through it. In March 1845, an article by Rind was published in the Dublin Medical Press detailing the procedure. Quote, In the space of a minute, all pain, except that caused by the operation, which was very slight, had ceased, and she slept better that night than she had for months. After the interval of a week, she had slight return of pain in the gums of both upper and under jaw. The fluid was again introduced by 2 punctures made in the gum of each jaw, and the pain disappeared. She left the hospital on the 1st of August in high spirits and promised to return if she ever felt the slightest pain again. The hypodermic needle has since been used billions of times throughout the world. Florence Nightingale wrote of using one to take opium in 1866 after returning from the Crimean War. Quote, "Nothing did me any good but a curious little newfangled operation of putting opium under the skin, which relieves one for 24 hours. The phlebotomy service in Tala University Hospital is called the Rind unit in honor of the surgeon."
It is, again, like I said, I hadn't heard of it. It's fascinating. It's one part of me was going, that's unreal that, back then they're coming up with all these, medical ways of treating people in great pain. And the other part, I think the horror film fan part of me was thinking of how big was the needle and what was how sore was it? But it's not just because it's to do with the Irish connection, but it's just when you think of these people that were doing, an improvised, device to put morphine on the skin. It's incredible.
Yeah. So the thing about that one, I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to include, as you said, I didn't just want to look at it from a political perspective or look at it from sports, even though there is lots of politics in the book and there are sporting events in the book, but things like that, kind of innovation and new inventions and that kind of a thing. I wanted to include that. Now, I will say, everything I included there is obviously, sourced. Those quotes are sourced and those dates are sourced and all of that. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were very similar devices being used in or around the same time. But that is a documented example of the hypodermic needle being used. But having said that, that could be contested. Somebody could say, but what about this date in this city or in this country or whatever? But what I would say about that is Francis Rind, when he was fashioning this improvised device, I doubt he was copying somebody in, another country. I think he was basically coming up with what he thought as a solution to this woman's problem. So yeah, it is really interesting, and I kind of wish that things like that were better known, because Irish history tends to focus on people who fought in battles or people who fought at various rebellions in history, or political leaders, as well, like Charles Stewart Parnell and Isaac Butt and people like that. And those are all very important people, but I kind of wish that we knew more about these kind of people as well. The funny thing about it, we talk about American history, is there is overlap there, because you have people like Benjamin Franklin, who obviously was very big into creating things, but he also was involved in the political side of things. But with this particular case, this particular doctor, he may have had political leanings, but I didn't include them in that entry in the book. I just talked about, he saw a problem, he came up with a solution. That solution has since been adapted and is obviously changed, but it's been used, as I say, billions of times around the world. And it is fascinating to think of it happening in Dublin at the time.
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to, like I said, I'll go through a few of the dates that I picked out, because obviously I picked those ones out in particular as my favorite, but there's a few here. So I'm not going to read them out, just pick the events. You have to go buy the book to read them, okay? That's the way things work. So 6th of January, 1839, the night of the big wind, I can't go into it, but there's almost like a M. Night Shyamalan twist in the middle of that, where I was like, they use it for what? They use the date for a particular reason. 19th of January, 1947, the big freeze begins. I bought my dad a book about that a few years ago when a book came out. Really, he loved the book. The 9th of February, 1846, Robert Mallet presents paper on earthquakes. Again, another one where you're talking about science, and I had no idea about it. 21st of March, 1879, first successful test of Brennan torpedo. So I've gone for weather and science. It's surprising me because I was so bad at school at science. This one was great, which I've read about before, but 23rd of March, 1847, the Choctaw Nation raises money for famine relief. And there is that amazing piece of sculpture in Ireland now celebrating it. 26th of March, 1990, My Left Foot wins 2 Oscars. I'm a big film fan, but you worded it in a way that I hadn't really thought about. I just thought about it being massive for obviously Ireland winning an Oscar. But I know Daniel Day-Lewis won as well. But the idea of it kick-started almost the idea of independent film in Ireland. And that is like, when that was nominated at the Oscars, because I look back at clips from the Oscars and you see the films it's up against. These are these massive like budget films, and this is this small, and it's incredible that it did what it did. Sorry, Annie Murphy's there. We have also got another one which I'm not sure I heard before, but I was kind of like, when you're not. Wasn't 100%. The 13th of April, 1742, Handel's Messiah makes world debut in Dublin. 30th of April, 1994, we all remember where we were when people were dancing around the stage. Riverdance debuts at Eurovision. 13th of May, 1937, statue of George II blowing up. Bit of violence in there. Is that the first bit of violence? It is. 16th of May, 1945, De Valera response to Winston Churchill. That was particularly interesting. I'd never seen that before, Padraic. Now, maybe because my dad does not like De Valera, that could be the reason that I've never heard it. But he really went for him is probably not the correct way of putting it, but it was pretty biting for the times, I guess.
Yeah, it was good. It was just after the Second World War, and it's funny, the language that De Valera used was quite harsh. You absolutely would not get it from a Taoiseach today. They just wouldn't talk about the relationship between Britain and Ireland, or England and Ireland, depending on how you look at it. You wouldn't get them talking that way today. And I didn't write it in such a way. One thing when I was writing the book is I didn't want to show any bias. So I just sort of presented it as it was, you know. I'm fairly certain that every political party in Ireland comes under scrutiny in some way. And you could be a member of any party, you could be a De Valera man, or you could be a Collins man, or you could be a supporter of another political party. And there's chances are that you'll read something in the book and you might think that's not really fair, but in a way that's a good thing, because that shows that I wasn't trying to, play favorites. I don't know how well that comes across. That's not really for me to say. That's for other people to say. But yeah, that was an interesting speech from De Valera, just responding to Churchill.
Yeah, it was amazing. I hadn't heard of it. And talk about not taking sides and not being biased. 23rd of May 2002, the Saipan incident, when the whole country was divided between Keane and McCarthy. We have 3rd of June 1844, Hypodermic Needle. Sorry, we read that one. 20th of July. No, we read that one. 16th of August 1982, Patrick Connolly resigns. Scuba again. Not something I knew an awful lot about, but I found fascinating. And I, like you said earlier on, actually, I looked into it afterwards, and that's a great bit about the book, is that you can go down that route. 30th of September 1994, Boris Yeltsin pissed on an airplane, basically. 3rd of October 1992, Sinead O'Connor tears up the photo of the Pope. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. That was brave. 25th of October 1996. This was amazing to me. Last Magdalen Laundry closes in 1996. I couldn't get my head around that one. And the last one I have here is the 21st of December 1967. Solar alignment is observed at Newgrange. And is celebrated every year since, which is it's a great. I mean, as an building or an architectural achievement, it's pretty spectacular. But so they were, just so people give people a flavor of all the dates I had to pick from, and the 3 I picked, and I think it gives a good representation of the different subject matters within your book.
Yeah. Cheers. Yeah, so I wanted it to be diverse, and I wanted it to cover different areas. And another thing about the book is, as you mentioned, that you can pick it up and put it down. But I imagine some of the people who will read it might not read it from cover to cover. They might they might start reading and go, I'm not as interested in this. I'm just going to turn the page, and that's okay. You know, you don't have to read every single entry.
Yeah.
You know, you can just focus on the history that you're interested in. So that was what I was going for. But I hope anybody who reads it, if they do read it from cover to cover, they will, you know, end up, like you've said. I'm pleased to hear you say, you know, I didn't know about this, or I didn't know about that, or I hadn't heard about this, because that was sort of the point of the book, and that was this point of the social media account as well. Is you know, wow, I hadn't heard of that, you know, and it's something that applies to me too, because when I was researching the book and when I was, you know, preparing posts for the social media accounts, I would also come across things and be like, wow, I'd never heard of that. I must look into this further. I must see if I can read more about it, find out more information. So in a way, it's that's what I was doing, was passing on information.
Yeah, and there's a man and a book that comes up a few times in the book, and I just want to ask you kind of a cheeky question, I suppose. Have you read Ulysses?
So I told you I did English in UCD, and I had to read parts of Ulysses for that, but I have not read the whole thing.
Okay,
but I have read parts of it. Have you read it yourself?
No, do you know what? My dad, I don't know if he read it, but he definitely started it, and he kind of said to me, "Don't bother." You know, it's
the parts that I did start it, and then, you know, you'd have an elective on it, and you'd have to write an essay on a particular chapter, so you'd read that chapter, and it's very, very dense. And the thing is, it's not even James Joyce's densest book. Most people would say Finnegan's Wake is a far less accessible book than Ulysses. I did read, which is a much easier read, and it's much shorter, is Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which is quite interesting. And again, it's a really fascinating book because it talks about the politics at the time. You know, they're discussing home rule and these kind of things, you know, and it's not somebody writing it today and looking back. It's written at the time. But yeah, Ulysses, I don't know, maybe I'll get to it one day, but it is such a dense, complicated, not even complicated, but just sort of impenetrable book that you know, I think an awful lot of people would be in the same situation as you, as in they started the book, never finished it, you know? Yeah,
it's like I was reading a little bit about Joyce, and the entry point was Dubliners, and I read Dubliners, and I thought it was really, really great, you know, as short stories, but they seem to be very, you know, not formulaic, that's not the right word, but they seem to be written in in a way that I suppose someone like me could understand. But I found them really great, obviously well written and that, you know, but they're really great stories. But I never went further than that, and I'm probably won't. So what else you like to do in your spare time, Padraic?
Well, you know, living in Vancouver, it is a beautiful city, and there's a lot of nature. So obviously things have changed with the pandemic, and everybody's at home, and I don't think things have quite got back to normal. But, you know, pre-pandemic, it wouldn't be unusual to like go for a cycle or go for a walk, go for a hike, I should say. We used to live in the west end of Vancouver, which is near this very big park called Stanley Park, which anybody in Vancouver who's been to Vancouver will probably know. And it's a beautiful part of the world to go for a cycle around, because it's just outside the city. But you know, you come around and you come back by the beaches and that kind of a thing, and you get a beautiful view. And it's, you know, things like that. I'm a fairly relaxed person. I don't have a lot of you know, specific hobbies. I'm a bit like yourself. I like films and that kind of thing. So that would be sort of what I do in my
favorite film
of all time.
Of all time.
Oh God, Boogie Nights.
Oh, that's a great film. I mean, that's a great show. I've never heard anyone say that, and not because they didn't think it was good, but just it hasn't come up. And
not Irish related in any way, but
no, I mean, I don't think there's an Irish character in it, but I like. I'm a big fan of Paul Thomas Anderson's films in general, and you know, it wasn't one of my first that I'd seen by him, but I was one that kind of went back into his work, I guess, and I saw Boogie Nights, and it's brilliant. All his films are just.
Have you seen his newest one, Licorice Pizza?
That's another one I'm still waiting to see. It's not out here
I haven't
yet.
seen it either. No, is it not? Oh,
no.
Okay. It sort of came and went in Vancouver. it's funny, it feels like you have a window to see these films in the cinema, and if you don't see them in that window, then you have to wait for them to come on streaming or whatever.
Yeah. You know why though, don't
But
you?
it's also why is that?
Because they're making all these superhero films in Vancouver and they're putting them out in the American and Canadian cinemas, and you don't get a chance to see the smaller film. That's what's happening over here.
No, it's the same. It's the same everywhere. Yeah, the only films that anybody goes to see anymore really on a large scale are superhero films like Spider-Man or Batman. There's a new Batman film. It's just after coming out. So but I mean, again, that's the people's choice. If that's what they want to see, if you stopped 100 people in the street and said, would you like to see Batman or would you like to see Licorice Pizza? 90 of them will probably say, I'd like to see Batman. So, it's at the end of the day, that's what they're going to do. But it is a shame. But I mean, I do hope to watch that one. What's your favorite film?
My favorite film of all time is 12 Angry Men. I am.
That's a great film. Yeah,
I'm a big. I've watched it so many times. I've told the story why I really got into it. I watched it with my dad when I was quite young. Well, in my teen years, but it stayed with me ever since, and it's just one of those ones I can go back to.
It's a great film. Have you ever seen Anatomy of a Murder?
Oh, I have. Yeah, that's another one. It's
another good sort of same late 50s kind of courtroom legal drama in America. Yeah. But 12 Angry Men is a great film. Yeah.
I think that we can leave on that sentence because that's perfect. But listen, Padraic, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Thank you very much for writing this book. I've obviously told many people about it, and that's why I wanted to get you on to chat a bit more. If you wouldn't mind just sticking around for a minute until I close this out, I'll take a quick photo with you, and we'll be on our way.
Go for it, yeah.
Brilliant. Obviously, thank you very much, as always, to John for all the technical side of things, to Nathan for the promotion, to my mum, dad, granddad, Jer and Calvin. As always, you subscribe to our YouTube if you wouldn't mind. That would be very helpful. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you can find us there. Definitely go over to at This Day Irish on Twitter. You'll get more from Padraic. We're also on Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Google Podcasts, if that's the way you prefer to listen to it. Thanks to everyone for watching or listening. And Padraic, once again, thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks, Eric.
See you all next week, folks. Take care. Bye.